Thank you for joining me today. It's Brian Gubernick, and welcome to the No Days Off podcast, where we believe that every single day brings a new opportunity to get better. A handful of years ago, I think it was probably 2018, I read a book that I've definitely talked about here over the past almost 800 episodes. And this book changed how I handle difficult conversations, not just negotiations, but leadership talks and compensation discussions, vendor issues, even some personal conversations. That book was Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. Many of you have probably read it as well. And I would encourage you to pick it back up as I recently did. I forgot how good this book happens to be. In 2018 or 19 or whatever it was my favorite book that year. And it's absolutely amazing. Here's what struck me as I was reading through it again just recently. The conversations that Chris Voss talks about in that book, Never Split the Difference, it wasn't about winning per se. It's about understanding human psychology, especially when emotions are involved. Chris Voss was this FBI negotiator. And so emotions are almost always high in the scenarios that he was describing. And he had a deep understanding of human psychology. And pretty much every significant conversation or difficult conversation in business has emotion and psychology involved in it. So I want to talk about the 3 or 4 tactics from that book that I've used since I first read it, and that I'm going to, anchor to a little bit more now that I've refreshed on these tactics. Strategy number 1. Chris Voss is a huge fan of what's called tactical empathy. Tactical empathy. He isn't describing agreeing, or this isn't about being soft. It's about demonstrating that you understand the other side's position, even if you don't agree with it, even if you don't like it. So many of us default to or rush to logic, but logic doesn't land until emotions on the other side feel heard. So a simple example of this, maybe I'd say something like, hey, it sounds like you're under pressure to hit a deadline and don't want surprises. Now, that sentence specifically doesn't concede anything. It actually just lowers defenses. It sounds like you're under pressure to hit a deadline and don't want surprises. In business, people don't resist decisions necessarily. They resist feeling misunderstood. I think tactical empathy, that simple statement, buys you some space. So acknowledging the other side's position, understanding the other side's position, even if you don't like it, sets you up for success in that conversation. Now, strategy number 2, Chris Voss talks about labeling, which is simply naming the emotion. It's one of his most practical tools. You simply name what you believe the other person is feeling or experiencing. So the example might be, it seems like you're frustrated. Or it sounds like this puts you in a tough spot. Or it feels like there's some concern about risk here. Now, why does this work? When emotions are unnamed, they drive behavior, but they do so kind of silently. But when they're labeled, they lose their intensity. And in leadership conversations or negotiations or whatever it may be, I think this is pretty huge, because you're not trying to be right. You're trying to make the real issue visible. And once it's visible, then we can discuss something. Then we can manage it. It becomes far more manageable. Now, strategy number 3, it's probably my favorite, and I'm going to call it the if you were in my shoes strategy. I think it's deceptively powerful. Instead of pushing back directly, you ask something like, hey, if you were in my shoes, how would you make that happen? If you were in my shoes, how would you make that happen? Now, again, imagine a conversation where somebody is making certain demands or requests, and you say to them, and maybe you feel like, hey, they're kind of unreasonable here. Well, instead of digging your heels in and pushing back, maybe you ask, hey, I hear what you're saying. I got a question for you. If you were in my shoes, if you're on my side of the table, how would you go about making that happen? Now, I think this does three things pretty immediately. Number one, it shifts problem solving to the other side. Number two, it exposes whether the request is actually realistic because now they got to look at it from your side of the table. And then number three, it slows the conversation down. What I love so much about this particular strategy is that it really is non confrontational. It's also pretty firm, though. You're not saying no, you're saying, hey, help me understand how this works in reality. In my experience, oftentimes the other person realizes the gap that maybe they're creating with the request. And when they do, you didn't create resistance, you created more clarity around the conversation. Now, strategy number four, and it's one that we've taught many a time, here at No Days Off. It's been referenced in different ways, but strategy number four is about using how and what questions versus using why, questions that start with why. Chris Voss is very clear on this. We have to avoid questions that start with why. And that's because why questions feel accusatory, even when they're totally innocent. Instead, we need to anchor more to how and what. Maybe even questions that start with who, but it's usually much easier to anchor to how and what. So, for example, maybe ask instead of, hey, why are we so disconnected? Maybe you ask, how does this align with what you're trying to accomplish? Or instead of saying, hey, why do you think this is going to work? You might ask, hey, what does success look like on your end? These questions do something subtle but really important. They force the other side to engage their logic and not just dig their heels in and justify their position, which is what a why question will tend to do. In leadership and negotiation, the moment someone starts explaining how something works, they're no longer positioning or posturing. They are now in a position of collaboration. So here's the big lesson I took from Chris Voss. Negotiation isn't about being aggressive or being clever. I think a lot of people believe that to be the case. Negotiation to me is about slowing conversations down enough to reveal reality and then work towards what we would, call a win-win solution. When you study the best negotiators, they do a lot more listening than they do talking. They name emotions instead of fighting them. They ask questions that shift the responsibility from their side to the other. And then they never rush, no surprise here, to split the difference. I think if you're leading people, if you're negotiating deals, if you're navigating hard conversations, these are not tricks. These are skills that we can develop. And in my opinion, they are very much worth practicing. That's all I have for you today, the No Days Off podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, every single day brings a new opportunity to get better. So let's get after it.